Okay, it's all Kaylin.
Okay, so thank you everyone for attending this presentation first thing on a Friday morning. My presentation is called Neglect and Mistreatment under the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, AIRFA. So for a little bit of background, I want to really push forward this kind of thesis through which the whole argument is dependent. I think that without continual maintenance, cultural history will inevitably be lost. My first example for this is the great myth of the Great Library of Alexandria. So a lot of people think this library burned down in flames, but rather it actually died over 7 centuries. It actually was a long period of chastising intellectuals and slowly pushing away this loss of history. But the point here that I want to drive through is that this would have been part of our mutual heritage, but it was the neglect and non-maintained efforts to sustain it that resulted in this loss of history. Even today, for example, the Clock Tower of Mecca, the Temple Mount, and the Notre Dame Cathedral for Islam, Judaism, and Christianity respectively, each have their own bases to maintain their cultural identity. But for example, in the case of indigenous peoples, there isn't really that same base within the religion to support their cultural heritage. But not only that, from outside sources, there is not as much support. Like, for example, Notre Dame Cathedral, as we know, caught fire quite recently. However, they got international support, but there isn't quite that base yet for indigenous peoples. And in fact, that base is even declining. So with a little bit of history as to the indigenous peoples, well, when Christopher Columbus first arrived, it's estimated that there were as many as 100 million people across the Americas. So that includes South America too, including the Incas and the Aztecs as well. However, that population is down to about at least 1/5 of that. And whereas the populations in both Europe and the Americas, as the immigration population has grown, that population has grown to less than 2%. But more importantly, in terms of relevance to this presentation, is that there used to be thousands of religions across these millions of people, all mostly polytheistic. However, they were mostly through oral traditions. So they were slowly squeezed out as the Europeans moved, and most were sort of shifted over to Christianity. So population and economic growth has not been shared with the indigenous peoples, but rather their prosperity has in fact even been negative, as the World Bank presents that indigenous peoples are a culturally distinct society and communities within each of their respective countries. But although they make up 6% of the total global population, they account for 15% of the extreme poor, which is obviously a very, very large figure. At least they're doubling their, poverty to proportion of society. However, I think that is even greater in wealthier countries such as the United States and Canada, where there is an even larger gap between those in the ultra poor and ultra rich. So I would figure this figure is even larger. So this is kind of at least to since this is a religious course, to drive it to a Christian theme, is that there's the Matthew principle, for which it is called, for to everyone who has more will be given, and he will have abundance. But for those who have little, more will be taken away. So this is kind of, I think, sort of a momentum principle. But the theory is that because they have already suffered these disadvantages, it's harder for them to sort of switch the momentum and put themselves into an upward trend. So things are not going too well. So a book I read that kind of inspired my take on this was Guns, Germs, and Steel. So the theory that they try to present is that there is not, the theory they pose in the very beginning of the book is, why was it the Spanish conquered the Incas and Pizarro conquered the Incas rather than vice versa? Well, firstly, it was partially due to concentrate population density, which led to greater breeding of germs and the establishment of currency, religions, and empires. However, so the point is there is no like ethnic difference between indigenous peoples, but it's more just that they were in a more isolated space. But that does not provide reason for which they should not receive more support. So the colonizer, he presents 3 great unifiers. So the first great unifier of humankind was actually currency. Although we do have different currencies, currency is a one single language. You could go anywhere in the world and show them a US dollar, and you don't even have to say hello in that language, but they'll probably accept the US dollar. So that was probably what Jared Diamond considers the first great unifier of man. Then next came religions. Now today, we're pretty much, the whole world is divided in less than 5 religions pretty much dominate all humans. And then lastly, there are empires. But the point that I want to drive home here is that although there are currency, religion, and empires through which the colonization happened to the First Nations, although they did unify the peoples, they killed the existing infrastructure. And for that reason, there needs to be some sort of check or balance to maintain this. So as a result, in 1978, Jimmy Carter, the president at the time, signed a law called the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. Briefly, what it said, his opening statement was, in the past, government agencies and departments have on occasion denied Native Americans access to particular sites and interfered with religious practices and customs where such use conflicted with federal regulations. In many instances, the federal officials responsible for the enforcement of these regulations were unaware of the nature of the traditional Native religious practices and consequently of the degree to which the agencies inferred with such practices. So essentially what he means is he wants this to be sort of a restorative act, kind of, you could think of a more modern parallel, or you could use RFRA as an example. But one of my starting concerns with this is that it isn't quite proactive enough in nature, but more restorative in nature. But I'll go into further detail to bring it down. But nonetheless, it has proven to be quite unsuccessful. The landmark Supreme Court case, Ling v. Northwest Indian Cemetery Protective Association, also known as the Go Road case, involved the Forest Service Board in California at the time was trying to build a gasket road from Gasket to Orleans, California. But however, the region was a Native American religious site. So the first court actually shut down the Forest Services, and they appealed it to the next court. However, the Supreme Court shut them all down, and they actually allowed the road to be built. So even though this act exists, it doesn't seem to be strong enough. And this was during Reagan's code, so relatively recently too. And it's often considered to be AIRFA's final defeat, giving it the term or the title that it has no teeth. So what can we do? So I kind of broke it down into kind of just lined up all the things that I found wrong. Firstly, the word Indian is decidedly racist because the indigenous population is not from India, so it's a little bit just insensitive and inaccurate. I think the terminology protect and preserve is not strong enough, and I think the duty should be shifted away from the president and once again protect and preserve. So I'll break this down one by one. So first step, I would change the title of this act to the American Indigenous Religious Freedom Amelioration Act. Because I don't want it to just be maintaining that which already exists, but perhaps even something more proactive or something aimed towards improvement. I chose amelioration. I could have used improvement, but then it would have been AIRFA, which could have been kind of weird. But any other word that has a positive connotation, I think, is kind of necessary in this, alongside changing the word Indian to indigenous. And similarly, in the actual terminology of the text, I would include Indigenous Americans, replacing that in all relevant texts. Secondly, in terms of protect and preserve, I would change it to protect, preserve, and discover for Indigenous Americans their inherent right and freedom to believe and express. I think protect and preserve is too conservative in the sense that it is only maintaining that which already exists. However, if you include a word like discover, it kind of similar to my argument with amelioration, it leads to a proactive nature of this act. So not only does the government have a duty to defend and protect these sites and religious resources, but they should also go out of their way when possible to uncover and demystify these old religions that in many cases have entirely disappeared. Thirdly, I would change it to, rather than the president shall direct various federal departments, I say that each president shall select an officer to direct the various departments. Because in this way, some presidents might be apathetic. It might not just be on their agenda. They might even be, in fact, hopefully not, they might even be anti-indigenous. So if each president were tasked to assign a different person who would have hopefully sufficient powers, and perhaps I would include a clause outlining what powers they have. But if they assign a dedicated officer to address these concerns, I think that would be a much better way, especially considering the president has already a lot on their plate. That would be, in my opinion, a better way of handling this. And then fourth, I would start adding additional lines too. So furthermore, Indigenous people should receive compensation for showing reasonable evidence that past damage to a particular religious site, structure, or resource has been made. So this is just going back to actually providing teeth to, or a tool in which they can actually restore or even improve or ameliorate. So obviously the burden once is on the Indigenous peoples, which does have its faults, but I think it will be an additional mechanism in it alongside RIFRA or AIRFA, and an additional tool for them to advance their religion and perhaps even restore it, or even bring it beyond its original glory. And then lastly, I just want to point out that this can all be done in the same way Jimmy Carter did it. It could be passed as a new act. It doesn't. It obviously has to go through all the checks and balances, but it could be done through the exact same process. It could be an entirely new act, or it could be a modification or an amendment to the previous act, but either which could be done through the president's office, assuming it got the proper checks and balances. So in terms of perpetuity, I think this is it's still a very relevant issue. For example, Marlon Brando, well, this was a while ago. He said, "It's inaccurate. Our school books are hopelessly lacking, criminally lacking in revealing what our relationship was with the Indian." And pardon the term Indian. Obviously, we've kind of explained that Indigenous is the better term. But the point is that Marlon Brando, as he had spent a lot of time doing Westerns, particularly spaghetti Westerns, he realized that he was portraying the Indigenous people wrongly. But not only that, it's that outsiders have to speak up to actually make a difference. So I present here that we all have a responsibility here, and even someone as significant as Marlon Brando saw this. So I think AIRFA will create, for a reason and the powers to create meaningful differences for Indigenous peoples, AIRFA with a double A for amelioration, and therefore must be adopted. And then lastly, in terms of going forward, such things as the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C. is obviously a fantastic site. It's nowhere near the monuments that other religions can claim. However, it's a step in the right direction. However, my argument going forward, and perhaps a next step for further research or further legislation, is that there must be additional tools for not just religious aspects, but history in general and the culture of these Indigenous peoples. It obviously would be meritorious for them to link their aims with religion, in effect, so they can use this tool and similar tools. However, there needs to be similar acts for other aspects of Indigenous identity that has been lost over time. So, any questions? Thank you.
Great job. Okay, everybody come on back. Okay, beautiful. So, Nikki, let's start with you.
Great job, Kaylin. So I guess my question was, would there be a limit on the spending, for the money given to these communities? And just to make sure it's all federal spending or federal money that would, okay.
Actually, I would say no. That's why I said if they reasonably show evidence of past damages, I think because the word reasonable exists there should be no limit. If they can reasonably show $1 billion, then perhaps they should get it. But yeah. Okay.
I think Nikki's question is what would be the source, right? How would you decide who pays?
I would put it to federal funding, because it would be unfair to particular states, because the states weren't necessarily responsible for the colonization, and it would be the federal government.
Okay, great. Zaina, your question for Kaylin?
What do you think would be the biggest obstacle, or like if there are any, to getting these changes done or accomplished?
I think it would be, firstly, because there isn't really necessarily a parallel for other cultures or other peoples. So it might be seen as unequitable, creating or improving such legislation. But I think because something already exists, just improving it will already be an easier step.
And Carolyn?
Yeah, just to build on Zaina's question, how do you see this? You said it would be, are you looking at it as a congressional action through the Congress and Senate, or would you be looking at it as an executive order that the president would sign? How do you think we could get to the finish line with with your proposal?
Well, I believe with Jimmy Carter got it approved by the Senate and the House of Representatives. So I would think the same process would have to occur. Perhaps I'm not too sure the process of amending an act. Maybe it might be simpler, but I think it would probably be both upper and the lower house.
So you talk about Native American religions, and of course it's plural, but they were also an extremely spiritual, kind of along the way, we understand organized religion in the European sense frequently. But for Native Americans and indigenous people, they were engaged in a variety of spiritual practices that in some ways are akin to what we now call the so-called nuns, who are spiritual, but not Western institutional related. So how do you think you sell this to the members of Congress who have been very swayed by the politics of religion, right? And really, they look at organized religion as kind of as a convenient stepping stone to votes, just to put it crassly. So is religious the word you want to use, or do you prefer that just because of the First Amendment connotation?
Yeah, that is actually a really good point, because I was proposing that there should be additional legislation to address other things. So religion might even be kind of pigeonholing it already. But in terms of actually getting attention behind it, obviously the indigenous population is very small. So I think it is people like, obviously Marlon Brando wouldn't do it anymore, but celebrities or famous people to sort of champion this sort of thing and get it on their agenda.
Okay, all right, very nice job. We'll give everybody the golf clap. Okay, Kaylin, fantastic.